Let's get stuck into our last session of the day. So we have two more presentations in today's forum. First up, I'd like to introduce Maria Appel. Maria is the Human Factors Integration and Change Lead at Metro Trains Melbourne and my colleague, and she is a chartered human factors specialist with over 14 years experience across safety critical sectors, including aviation, defence and rail. Her work focuses on integrating human factors into the management of operational risk and into engineering and organisational change, including to support safe, effective decision-making in high-pressure environments. She's presenting today on why human factors is so critical to change management, especially when introducing technology, and I'm sure we'll be able to talk to a lot of what we have talked about already today. Welcome, Maria, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, for that introduction. So as Fiona said, I'm going to be talking about technology change, why human factors makes a difference, and I'm from Metro Trains Melbourne. So as time goes on, we are introduced to new innovation, and anytime we're introduced to new innovation, it is a change. All innovation is change, and anything that's ever occurred in the rail industry is innovation and a change. And in the beginning, it might seem like not that big of a deal to now we have these much more complex systems, but it's, I think, important to think about how these individual small, low-tech systems and changes that we made hundred years ago, how that actually still might have been a big impact to that time, even though now it seems like a nothing change, very low-tech, lo-fi, but these still have a huge impact to these users at the time. And I think that it's really important to think about, it's not just we're introducing CBI and complex signaling systems. We've been introducing technology changes to rail from the very start. And rail in itself is innovation. And it's also important to note that human factors didn't exist for the majority of the time that rail's been around. I don't know if that's true, maybe half. I didn't do the math. Anyway, so anytime you introduce an innovation or new technology, there's always risk because you're changing the operational environment, you're changing the maintenance environment. Risks can span everything from financial, from unions, to performance, to operational delays, to safety impacts. And if we manage those changes from the beginning, we're going to have the best result at managing those issues throughout the life cycle, which is why it's important that we manage it from the inception, from that beginning, that first moment in time that it's being conceived of and going to be introduced. If we have, systems that could potentially lead to increased workload or human error, we need to figure out how to manage this from the start so we have a better way to influence the design outcomes. So any innovation or change or new emerging technology, AI, all of it, it all has to comply with the state regulations in the Rail Safety National Law. All of that needs to comply with the management of change process and human factors integration process, along with everything. Special attention really needs to be directed at anything that's new, novel, and different. Those are going to play a key role in how the change is classified and what assurance is delivered. Adding on to that, assurance is really about showing the risks are all managed, and as a part of that, that's where HFI comes in, and that's where those HF inputs and assurance activities will help deliver the change. You're also required to involve relevant stakeholders with both consideration and consultation. And with any innovation and change, particularly for new technology, it's really important that we allow sufficient time to compensate for the impact that a new change might have. So if you have something that's kind of bog standard, you might not need to allow for additional time to update the procedures and internal processes, training, assurance. But if you have something that's very innovative, a new signaling system, you're going to need to allow for more time in that project to allow that proper change management system to do the things it needs to do, because it is a much bigger impact Any change, whether big, small, needs to look at a system level impact. If you are never just copy and pasting a system into a ways of working, or into a procedure, into a desk, it's always integrated into a complex system. And we always need to consider those wider system impacts. And finally, especially for trials, if we're just changing a little bit here, a little bit there, it still doesn't mean that we can't look at the broader impacts. If you're adding just a little screen at a station, it doesn't mean that it's not impacting on drivers or train controls. You need to make sure that everything is considered, all of these users are considered, even if it's very small or isolated to a specific location. So as I mentioned, management of change, HFI, all of that is still applying to any innovation, and it's super key in this new technology, any kind of technology that's being rolled out. Even if it's old technology, if it is a big technology change for that location or that rail network, it's going to be new and novel and different and potentially very complex. HF is key in how we manage a lot of our risks when they come to humans. When the risk is very complex, we're going to likely need a higher level of HF rigor, which will help manage any HF issues, such like that. If it's a more known change, you might not have to have as complex of a change or a complex of a change management process and complexity of EHFA. When you have a more complex change in more in-depth EHFA, early human factors analysis will likely need to be undertaken. And EHFA is basically what defines the impacts of the users, any requirements, standards, that any kind of HF activities that will need to occur throughout the life cycle of a process. So how we define that up front is really important. And that's where the EHFA comes in key. And with these very complex pieces of technology, the EHFA might not just be as kind of simple looking at change impacts, developing requirements, but you might actually do preliminary assessments like a workload study or an ergonomic assessment to kind of understand the baseline and the potential impacts, which can then drive and inform the change further. In delivery, these more complex projects might look at more iterative analysis or progressive workload studies. You might also have more workshops to ensure that the solution meets the user needs, keep going back to redefine those requirements. So what are the benefits other than just complying to rail safety national law to applying human factors in innovation and new technology? Early HF involvement is key to ensuring that a design and a system is fit for purpose. If we can inform the design up front, we're going to be able to have a better design outcome. We're going to optimize usability, safety, and we're going to allow for an easier transition. Along those same lines, if we have a system that's easier to use and safer, and the transition is easier, we're going to have higher user acceptance. When you get HF engaged from the beginning, that means you're also getting users engaged from the beginning, and you're going to have a better chance of having user acceptance. The other thing that, especially for trials in a project, new technology, there's always goals and a way to define how successful something can be. And through that definition of the success criteria, HF can come in and say, all right, it's not just about, is the system itself successful? Has the system done the thing that it needs to do? Has it helped manage workload? Has it helped increase efficiency in our end users? Has it decreased human error? Has it done these things? Has it helped them do their job better? And so with HF involved from the start, we can help define that success criteria for those projects. Now, I've talked very generally so far, and so now I'm going to get into some specific examples of how anybody can apply HF in projects and innovation to get the best outcome for our users in our systems. The first one being iterative design and how we can use that to get those best design outcomes. The example I'm going to talk about is using software, but we can do anything. I've used mockups with workstations. You can do cab layouts. Corey showed some mockups for hardware. So there's all kinds of stuff we can do here. The first step is basically talking to the end users and figuring out how they do their job, how this system is going to slot into their existing tasks, and how we can use it to meet their needs. From there, we can write requirements and use that to create mockups, or wireframe. There's all different kinds of ways to do this. You can have static ones, you can have ones built with software tools to make them more interactive. But you can start that mockup of these systems and test them with end users. And from there, once the design is a bit refined, it's been used, approved by the users, then you go and actually get it hard coded. That's then going to be presented in front of end users again. You'll maybe do usability studies. It's again based on the requirements, the early human factors analysis recommendations, standards, best practices, moving that forward. Then you run that by end users to get to kind of that final design that will be able to be used and be accepted by those users. And we have taken them along that entire journey. And the design is not based on anecdotes. It's based on evidence-based science of doing these proven methods of collecting user feedback across multiple users and not just centering the design on one specific person's preferences. So I think that's really important. Why it's critical to get HF involved, not just make sure that we're doing the things that we need to do and getting users involved, but we're actually getting the best outcomes for our users. Another area that has been mentioned several times, Paul spoke about automation and AI. And although I will be talking about automation, everything I'm about to talk about in this section definitely applies to AI and how we look at that and adapt that as time goes on, but I'll be specifically talking about automation. But automation, like Paul said, is used to support humans, not replace them. And I think that's really important. And here I have some different examples of automation and how things have evolved. And none of these are necessarily replacing users. It's just making a safer, a system that's easier to be used by all of our users. And as time goes on, the complexity of this automation is growing. And so HF is going to be more and more important, especially with AI coming. So the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors in the UK developed a white paper on automation and how it can be managed in projects. They identified 6 human factors challenges in automation, and this tool is meant to help resolve those. And you will see several callbacks to things that Paul talked about earlier. One of them being it's very important to keep this human in the loop and situationally aware. And if we don't do that and something goes wrong, how do we know that the human is actually going to be able to respond to the situation in an appropriate way? Or have they been daydreaming and not paying any attention? And so they need 5 minutes to figure out what's going on, or have they been, are these vigilance systems or tasks that we're having them do, keeping them aware of what's going on? So that's really important and something that Paul spoke about. Another one is around the trust of the system and we want a balanced sense of trust. We want it to be critical in the sense that they're going to let it do its job, but also they're not going to become complacent by not thinking it ever makes a mistake, because those two can result in issues, usability, potentially even safety impacts if you are not addressing those in a timely manner. But addressing these proactively is the number one key that we need to keep in mind. So as I said, the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors in the UK developed a tool that is going to help address these challenges in automation. It is an accessible tool that can be used by both non-HF specialists and HF specialists early on in a project to dive into these challenges and look at these themes in these challenges, and then how can they be fixed as the project is going on, what needs to be done throughout the life cycle. It will help identify HF design requirements. It will help inform further HF analysis and decision-making. It's very important that this is done early on because you know exactly how to scope it out. Another important item that HF needs to be looking at when it comes to new technology is around procedures and ways of working. The big thing that EHFA does is identify the user impacts. And if we can do that early on, we can then kind of inform how the new system will be integrated. And the big way we do that is by observation, not just reading a procedure or talking to managers, but going in and seeing how they actually do the job, because work imagined versus work is done is very different. If you've ever compared the two. So we need to base how it is integrated on actually how it's done. And during the assessment, the delivery phase of a project, you'll do different HF assessments, such as a task analysis, and those can then inform any procedure updates or training. It basically ensures that the technology is going to fit the role and how it should be done, and you're not just forcing procedures in without considering the wider impacts. And then usually, pretty much every project will have, residual HF issues, and those really need to be input into training and addressed in that way. And to wrap this up, this is my last slide. The most important thing is that we integrate human factors from the start of any project, because it will help define what success looks like, not just for the users, or not just for the business, but for the users. It's going to look at everything from a wide system level and translate any kind of user impacts or user needs into requirements, into further studies that need to be completed to have the best outcome possible. That's why we can give evidence-based solution, not just personal preferences. It's really important to not just design a system on anecdotes, which is why it's important to apply human factors principles, have that user-centered design, so it's not just driven by one person's preference in a user group. Like, imagine if these devices that Corey was working on were designed by that tall guy whose name I can't remember versus her. I mean, like she said, one person's not going to have a good outcome, but if we apply human factors and it looks at the 5th to 95th, it's going to have a much better outcome for everybody. And then once we have completed a project, post-commissioning, or like immediately following, not a post-implementation review, but during commissioning, post-commissioning, going out on site, going with those end users, seeing how they've actually implemented that new system, that innovation, that change, collecting feedback. And this can also be integrated as part of iterative design, doing trials in the process of rolling out a new system. But it's really important to observe people, collect feedback, and use that to inform any future projects or even the current project. You can also do surveys and get feedback from users that way. It's good because it can be anonymized, and sometimes people feel very uncomfortable talking to people in the ivory tower. So, surveys are a way that people can provide feedback in a much safer way. And this also can get feedback on how the system's going. And there's surveys that have been developed from across the world. There's the Trust of Automated Systems test that can look at how much people use the automation. You can do a baseline and then have different iterations of the survey to see how the trust is growing as the technology is rolling out and people are getting used to it. And then also in the post-implementation review, which is to take place 3 to 6 months after a change has been implemented, that's when we go back and see, now that they have adapted to the system, how is it meeting their needs? Are they using it? How is it going? Are there any issues? We can also use those findings to inform future technology, because in a post-implementation review, you collect lessons learned, and those should be integrated into future projects. That is my presentation. I want to thank the other speakers and Fiona and everybody for attending. And we can send out my slides. I think I am definitely under time, so.
You're under time. So if anybody has any questions for Maria around human factors, integrating into change, please jump on the Q&A. We've got a little bit of time for some questions for Maria. Let's make it difficult for her. and I'll put it in a development review. It's all good. Can you talk a little bit? I think one of the challenges that we often have in this space is getting really effective early human factors analyses at the front end to figure out what a human factors program of work should look like. But can you talk just a little bit around the importance of requirements identification as part of that front end piece of work, and how doing that effectively can help, not just with human factors integration, but also perhaps less around reliance of some of those administrative controls like the SRACs that came up in Corey's example. Could you talk a little bit more around the work you've done in that space?
Sure. If you can minimize any review or any rework, obviously you're going to save money. If you know that system is going to be a complex software project that is going to be this brand new HMI, and in the EHFA you can say the contrast of the text needs to be this, I cannot remember off the top of my head, or this is how alerts should look, or don't place a dumpster that you can crawl on next to a ledge that is on top of a platform that's elevated so you can climb. If you can do these things early on, you're going to save the project money. You're going to help inform the design. You're not going to have to look at it again. And if you can get those low-hanging fruit done in the beginning, as long as you have to do the V&V cycle to make sure that everything's implemented properly. But you're going to save time. You're going to save money. You're going to improve safety outcomes. And by doing that earlier, the better, because it's safe. Like, you're not going to have to re-prosecute anything. Re-prosecution is very expensive. And if you come back something, you don't have a requirement for something that was easy, and then it's too late because the software's already developed, the concrete's already poured, you're just going to have to put a sign up. And we all know how poorly signs work. And that's obviously a less safe, less ideal safety outcome.
Thank you for that. There is a question in the chat also now in the Q&A from Connor around the post-implementation review. Sometimes this isn't incorporated into a project's human factors activities, despite the fact that it's a really critical part of a human factors change lifecycle activity, including just a feedback into future change, and maybe for that reason it's perhaps more beneficial for a rail organisation, maybe because we are the constant, particularly if work's being done by consultants and others. Can you talk a little bit around how a post-implementation review can be effectively integrated into a program, or ways to sort of make the case for a good PIR?
So there's a couple ways we can do that. In the EHFA, for example, you can call that out, because in EHFA, ideally, you're going to say throughout the life cycle of the project, this is how HF should be integrated. And you can say the bog standard stuff, sitting in SIDS. You also should have very specific analysis. Do a workload study at X control center, drivers, etc. But then, as part of that, also you could say, complete that post-implementation review that looks at the effectiveness of controls and collects any lessons learned. So defining it there is a really good way to help get it integrated. That would be probably my best advice. I'm sure Fiona can add more. But yeah, that's probably the key thing. Again, at Metro, we have a human factors integration procedure and a management of change procedure that says that needs to be done. So we also not only have that human factors procedure to rely upon, but we have the management of change procedure that says you have to look at a change post-review, which is also part of Rail National Safety Law. It says you have to look at a change once it's been done. So that's pretty important to also note.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, look, obviously it's a really critical part of our program here at Metro, particularly for continuous improvement, and particularly where you're getting similar change happening on the network. obviously, as you say, there's benefits in not repeating work, but also applying the lessons from one project to another to not just get more effective outcomes for the users, but also improve the way we integrate human factors as well. So, yeah, some really good information there, and I'm sure, and I hope for a lot of people this is not news. And this is something that we are really trying to lift up the quality of the human factors integration activities in change. And from a industry standard point of view, AS 7470, I'm going to get it wrong, the human factors integration standard that came out and has been recently updated talks a lot about ways to do this effectively, and also the management of change standard is being updated and coming out imminently, also talks to ways that this can be done effectively. So we're really trying to integrate this into standards at a industry level too. Thank you very much, Maria.